They say wisdom comes with age, but I've learned that sometimes the greatest education arrives in the form of betrayal served cold on a Tuesday morning, over coffee and toast. For 60 years I believed marriage was about growing old together, sharing dreams, and building a life where both voices mattered equally. At 72, I discovered that some people view their spouse not as a partner, but as a comfortable piece of furniture that served its purpose and can be easily replaced when something shinier catches their eye. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Richard Thompson, though everyone calls me Maggie, and until 3 months ago I thought I knew exactly who I was. The dutiful wife of Richard Thompson, retired librarian, grandmother of 4, and the woman who always had dinner ready by 6 and never questioned where the investment statements went. Each month, Rick handled all our finances, you see, because that's how things were done when we married in 1964. He earned the money as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company, and I managed the household budget he allocated to me each month. What he didn't know was that I had been quietly building my own financial empire for the past 30 years. It started innocently enough in 1994 when I was still head librarian at the Wauwatosa Public Library. A patron had left behind a copy of One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch, and instead of placing it in the lost and found, I found myself reading it during my lunch breaks. The way Lynch explained investing wasn't the intimidating world of numbers and charts that Rick always claimed it was, when he'd wave away my occasional questions about our retirement planning. It was logical, methodical, almost like cataloging books or researching reference questions. That weekend, while Rick was at his Saturday golf game, I walked into a local bank and opened a small savings account with $200 from my own earnings. Just Maggie Thompson, not Mrs. Richard Thompson. The young banker, a woman about my daughter's age, didn't ask why I wanted my own account or suggest I add my husband's name. She simply processed the paperwork and handed me my first bank book with a smile. Over the following months, I began reading everything I could about investing. The library had an extensive business section, and I made friends with the financial periodicals, Forbes, Fortune, the Wall Street Journal. During my breaks, instead of chatting with colleagues about weekend plans or grandchildren's soccer games, I was absorbing lessons about compound interest, dividend growth, and market cycles. My first stock purchase was 10 shares of Johnson & Johnson at $42 per share. $420 that took me 6 months to save from my small salary and careful budgeting of grocery money. I chose it because I understood the company, used their products, and had read about their consistent dividend payment. Rick never noticed the modest amount missing from my household allowance, because I had become an expert at finding small savings. Generic cereal instead of name brand, coupons clipped religiously, sales planned around our meal schedules. For 30 years I continued this quiet discipline. Every month, whatever I could save from my librarian salary and later my pension went into that account. I reinvested dividends, researched companies during my free time, and slowly built a portfolio that reflected decades of careful study and patient accumulation. When technology stocks began their rise in the late 90s, I bought Microsoft and Intel. When I noticed everyone shopping at Walmart and Home Depot, I added those to my holding. During the 2008 financial crisis, while Rick worried about our 401k statements and talked about eating beans until the market recovered, I quietly purchased additional shares of strong companies at discounted prices. Rick never asked about my days at the library, beyond polite inquiries about whether it was busy. He never wondered why I spent evenings reading financial magazines instead of romance novels. When I retired in 2009, he assumed my pension would barely cover my personal expenses, and perhaps contribute a modest amount to our household budget. What he didn't realize was that my small monthly additions over 3 decades, combined with compound growth and reinvested dividends, had created something substantial. By the time Rick made his devastating announcement, that Tuesday morning in March, my personal investment account contained just over $3 million. Our life in the Wauwatosa neighborhood had always followed predictable patterns. Rick played golf twice a week, attended Rotary Club meetings, and maintained friendships with men he'd known since high school. I organized our social calendar around church events, book club meetings, and family gatherings. Our two-story colonial house with its red brick facade and mature oak trees had been our home for 40 years. The mortgage was paid off, the property taxes were manageable, and Rick often mentioned how comfortable our retirement would be once we sold it and moved to something smaller. What changed everything was Patricia Henderson. Pat was 45, recently divorced, and had joined our church 6 months earlier. She had shoulder-length blonde hair that always looked professionally styled, wore clothes that suggested a successful career, and possessed the kind of confident energy that made people notice when she walked into a room. Rick began mentioning her name occasionally after church service. Pat had interesting opinions about the sermon. Pat was looking for recommendations for a good financial advisor. Pat had invited him to join a new Bible study group that met Thursday evenings. I didn't think much of it initially. Rick had always been social, and I appreciated that he was making new friends as we navigated our 70s. When he started coming home from the Thursday Bible study sessions, energized and talkative in ways I hadn't seen in years, I was genuinely happy for him. He would describe the group's discussions about faith and modern challenges, often mentioning how Pat brought fresh perspectives that made him think differently about Scripture and life. The shift began subtly. Rick started suggesting I might enjoy updating my wardrobe, perhaps trying a different hairstyle, maybe joining a fitness class to keep up my energy. Comments that felt supportive initially but carried an undertone I couldn't quite identify. When I mentioned articles I had read or opinions about current events, he would nod politely but then change the subject quickly, as if my thoughts were pleasant, but not particularly engaging. Then came the technology comment. Rick had never shown interest in learning about computers or smartphones, beyond basic functions, but suddenly, he was talking about staying current with modern communication methods. He purchased a new phone and began spending time learning features he claimed were necessary for keeping in touch with old friends. When I struggled with operating the new smart TV he had insisted we needed, he would sigh with barely concealed impatience and suggest that some people adapt better to change than others. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday. I had prepared Rick's usual breakfast of scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and coffee, and was reading the local newspaper while he scrolled through something on his phone. The March sunlight streamed through our kitchen windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, and illuminating the familiar scene of our morning routine. Rick cleared his throat in the way he did when he was preparing to say something he considered important. I looked up from an article about the city's budget discussions, expecting him to share news about a golf tournament or ask me to add something to our grocery list. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, fixed me with a look that seemed almost pitying and said, "Maggie, we need to talk about our future." The tone was gentle but carried an authority that immediately put me on alert. This wasn't the voice he used for discussing vacation plans, or whether we needed to call a plumber. This was the voice he had always used for making major announcements about our lives. The voice that had told me we were moving to Wisconsin when his company transferred him. The voice that had explained why we couldn't afford a second car when the children were young. The voice that had decided when it was time for me to retire from the library. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he continued, setting down his phone and folding his hands on the table, "about where we are in our lives, what we want our remaining years to look like." I folded the newspaper and gave him my full attention, though something cold was beginning to settle in my stomach. "The truth is, Maggie, we've grown apart. We're different people than we were when we got married, and I think we both deserve to spend our final years with someone who truly understands us. Someone who shares our interests and energy level." The words seemed to echo in the kitchen, bouncing off the walls and settling into corners where they would linger long after this conversation ended. I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. "I know this is difficult," Rick said, his voice taking on the patient tone he might use with a confused customer, "but I think it's time we considered the possibility that we might both be happier if we made some changes." "What kind of changes?" I managed to ask, though part of me already knew. Rick reached across the table and patted my hand in a gesture that felt more condescending than comforting. I've been spending time with Pat Henderson, and she's helped me realize that I still have a lot of living to do. She's vibrant. She's interested in traveling and experiencing new things, and she makes me feel like the man I still am inside. The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly, as if the foundation of our house had shifted just enough to make everything feel unstable. Are you telling me you're having an affair? The question came out more calmly than I felt. I'm telling you that I've met someone who appreciates me in ways that remind me what it feels like to be truly alive, Rick replied, not quite answering my question, but making his meaning clear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Actually, I do. Rick picked up the top statement, his eyes scanning the numbers. I watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief to something approaching shock as he flipped through additional pages. This has to be a mistake, he said finally. These numbers can't be right. They're quite accurate. I've been tracking my returns carefully. But how? When did you? Rick's voice trailed off as he continued staring at the statements. I opened my first investment account in 1994. I explained calmly. I started with a few $100s and added to it consistently over the years. Compound growth is remarkably powerful when you give it enough time. Rick looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't just surprise, it was the look of someone realizing they had fundamentally misjudged a situation they thought they understood completely. You've had over $2 million all this time, and never told me. You never asked about my financial activities, Rick. You assumed I was incapable of managing anything more complex than a household budget. Rick set the statements down carefully as if they might explode. This changes everything. Does it? I asked. Well, obviously, if you have this kind of money, the division of assets becomes much more complicated. We'll need lawyers, financial advisors, maybe even a mediator. I smiled at him across the breakfast table where he had announced the end of our marriage just 24 hours earlier. Rick, I think you're misunderstanding something fundamental about this situation. What do you mean? These aren't marital assets. This account was opened in my name only, funded with my earnings, managed through my decisions. It's separate property. Rick's face went through several color changes as he processed this information. But we're married. Everything we own is jointly held. Not everything, I corrected gently. And certainly not after you've made it clear that our marriage is over. I reached across the table and gathered up my investment statements. I think you'll find that your calculations about supporting two households may need some revision. Especially if you're planning to help Pat with her financial difficulty. Rick sat in stunned silence as I loaded our breakfast dishes into the dishwasher. When I finished, I turned back to him, with the same pleasant expression I had worn for 60 years of marriage. I'm going to spend the day with Stephen Mitchell, my financial advisor. When you're ready to have a serious conversation about our future, one based on accurate information about both our situations, please let me know. I picked up my purse and car keys, leaving Rick alone in the kitchen with his phone and his suddenly much more complicated plan. As I backed out of our driveway, I could see him through the window, still sitting at the table where he had expected to negotiate the terms of my dependence on his generosity. Instead, he was beginning to understand that yesterday's news had been writing tomorrow's headlines all along. Stephen Mitchell's office occupied the corner suite of a downtown Milwaukee high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Lake Michigan. I had been meeting with Stephen quarterly for 15 years, but this was the first time I had requested an emergency appointment. His secretary, efficient woman named Carol, had rearranged his schedule when I explained that my circumstances had changed dramatically. Stephen greeted me with the warm professionalism that had made our relationship so comfortable over the years. Unlike many financial advisors who seemed to patronize older women, Stephen had always treated my questions and investment decisions with genuine respect. He had watched my portfolio grow from a modest collection of blue-chip stocks to a sophisticated mix of growth companies, dividend aristocrats, and international funds. "Maggie, you sounded quite determined on the phone yesterday," Stephen said as we settled into the leather chairs in his conference area. You mentioned that it was time for some significant changes. I placed my purse on the small table between us and looked out at the lake, where early spring sunlight was dancing across the water. My husband has decided that after 60 years of marriage, he's ready for a new chapter in his life, with someone else. Stephen's expression remained professionally neutral, though I caught a slight tightening around his eyes. I'm sorry to hear that, Maggie. That must be very difficult. Actually, it's been quite liberating, I replied, turning back to face him. For the first time in decades, I can make financial decisions based entirely on my own goals and interests. What kind of decisions are you considering? I opened my purse and withdrew a folder containing notes I had made the night before. I want to understand all my immediate liquidity needs, tax implications of various strategies, income planning for a single household, and estate planning revisions. Stephen leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpened. In 15 years of managing my portfolio, he had never seen me approach decisions with this level of systematic preparation. Let's start with your immediate situation, he said, pulling out a legal pad. Are you planning to remain in your current home? That depends on several factors. The house is in both our names, purchased long before I began investing. Rick assumes it will need to be sold to provide him with funds for his new lifestyle. I consulted my notes. However, I'm not particularly attached to maintaining that property. It's too large for one person, and the memories are becoming less pleasant by the day. Stephen nodded, making notes. What about your long-term housing goals? I want something smaller, more manageable, but with character and charm. Perhaps a condominium in one of the renovated buildings downtown, or a small house in a walkable neighborhood with cultural amenities. I paused, considering. Money isn't the primary constraint for the first time in my adult life. I want to choose based on what would make me genuinely happy. Your portfolio could certainly support that kind of flexibility. Stephen agreed. At current dividend yields, you're generating approximately $90,000 annually in income, and that's before any principal appreciation. The number still surprised me, even though I had calculated it myself. $90,000 a year from investments I had built through careful saving and patient reinvestment, more than Rick's final salary, and more than twice what we currently spent on our household expenses. I've been thinking about philanthropy as well, I continued. For 30 years I've been focused on accumulation and growth. Now I'd like to consider how this wealth might be used to support causes I care about. Stephen's pen paused over his legal pad. What kinds of causes? Financial literacy programs for women, particularly older women, who find themselves needing to manage money for the first time. Scholarship funds for non-traditional students returning to education later in life. Maybe something supporting libraries and literacy programs. I smiled slightly. I spent most of my career helping people find information they needed. This could be an extension of that work. Those are wonderful goals, Maggie. Have you considered establishing a charitable foundation or donor-advised fund? I've been reading about both options. I think I'd prefer something that allows me to be actively involved in grant-making decisions rather than simply writing checks. We spent the next hour reviewing my portfolio in detail. Stephen pulled up current market values, analyzed asset allocation, and projected various income scenarios based on different withdrawal strategies. The numbers painted a picture of financial security that would have seemed impossible when I made my first $400 stock purchase 3 decades earlier. There's one more issue we should discuss, Stephen said as our meeting began winding down. Your husband's potential claims on these assets. I've been researching that question, I replied. Since the account was opened with my separate funds, maintained separately throughout our marriage, and funded entirely through my earnings, I believe it should be considered separate property. Wisconsin is a community property state, which complicates matters somewhat. However, you're correct that assets acquired through separate funds, and maintained separately, can retain their separate character. Stephen made additional note. I'd recommend consulting with a family law attorney to ensure you're fully protected. Do you have someone you'd recommend? Actually, yes. Patricia Reeves has handled several similar cases involving older women with significant separate assets. She's both knowledgeable and discreet. I found it mildly amusing that I would be consulting with another Patricia about protecting my assets from the financial demands of the first Patricia who had entered my life. Could you arrange an introduction? Of course, I'll call her office this afternoon. When I arrived home that evening, Rick was waiting in the living room with an expression I recognized from his business career. It was the look he wore when preparing to negotiate a deal he considered particularly important. He had changed into his best casual clothes and appeared to have spent time rehearsing what he wanted to say. "Maggie, I think we got off on the wrong foot this morning," he began as I hung up my coat. "I was surprised by the information about your investments, and I may have reacted poorly." "How so?" I asked, settling into my usual chair across from the couch where he was sitting. "Well, I think I gave the impression that I was only interested in the financial aspects of our situation." "That's not true at all." Rick leaned forward, adopting what he probably thought was a sincere expression. "The money doesn't change anything about my feelings or my desire to build a new life with Pat." "I see. So what does it change?" Rick hesitated, clearly working through talking points he had prepared. "It changes how we structure our separation. If you have significant assets of your own, then obviously you don't need as much support from me. That would free up resources for me to help Pat get back on her feet financially." The transparent self-interest in this statement was almost breathtaking. Rick had spent less than 24 hours adjusting from a narrative where he was generously supporting his helpless ex-wife to one where her independence conveniently freed him to spend more money on his girlfriend. "That's very logical," I agreed, "though I'm curious about Pat's financial situation. Yesterday you mentioned she was having difficulties since her divorce." Rick's expression brightened, apparently relieved that I was taking such a reasonable approach to his girlfriend's money problem. "Pat's ex-husband was financially abusive. He controlled all their assets and left her with significant credit card debt when he filed for divorce. She's been struggling to make minimum payments while trying to rebuild her credit." "How much debt are we talking about?" "Around $80,000, mostly credit cards but some medical bills and legal fees from the divorce proceedings." Rick's voice took on the protective tone he now used when discussing Pat's wealth. "She's been working with a credit counseling service, but her income as a part-time receptionist barely covers her basic living expenses." I did quick mental calculation. $80,000 in high-interest debt would require payments of at least $1,500 per month just to stay current, assuming Pat could qualify for any debt consolidation options. On a part-time receptionist salary, that would be nearly impossible. "And you're planning to help her with these obligations?" "I want to give her a chance to start fresh," Rick said firmly. "She's been through enough hardship. It's time someone treated her with the kindness and generosity she deserves." The irony was striking. Rick was prepared to spend his retirement savings helping a woman he had known for 6 months escape financial problems, while assuming his wife of 60 years would be content with whatever resources remained after his generosity had been distributed. "Have you calculated how much this fresh start might cost?" I asked. Rick shifted uncomfortably. "We haven't worked out all the details yet, but Pat isn't asking for anything unreasonable. She just needs enough support to pay off her debts and get established in a better living situation. $80,000 for debt relief, plus moving expenses, plus ongoing support while she transitions to better employment." I mused aloud. "That could easily approach 6 figures in the first year alone. It's an investment in our future together," Rick said defensively. "Besides, with your financial situation being so much stronger than I realized, the pressure on our joint assets is significantly reduced." I studied my husband's face as he outlined his plans to spend substantial sums supporting another woman's lifestyle, while simultaneously dissolving our marriage. The man who had once lectured me about clipping coupons and buying generic groceries was now prepared to finance his girlfriend's debt consolidation and living expenses. "Rick, have you discussed any of this with a financial advisor?" "I don't need a financial advisor to understand basic mathematics, Maggie. I've been managing money successfully for decades." "Of course, though your calculations seem to assume that my assets would somehow offset your obligations to me as part of our divorce settlement." Rick's confident expression faltered slightly, What do you mean? I mean that my separate property doesn't eliminate your responsibility for an equitable division of our marital assets. The house, your retirement accounts, our joint savings, those would still need to be divided regardless of what I've accumulated on my own. The color began draining from Rick's face as the implications of this statement sank in. But if you don't need financial support, whether I need support and whether I'm entitled to an equitable share of assets we've accumulated together are two entirely different legal questions, I said gently. Just as your desire to help Pat with her financial problems doesn't change your obligations to our marriage. Rick sat in silence for several moments, apparently recalculating scenarios that had seemed much simpler an hour earlier. I think we should probably consult with some professionals about all of this. I agree completely. In fact, I've already scheduled a meeting with a family law attorney for next week. You've hired a lawyer. I've arranged a consultation. I want to understand my rights and obligations before we make any irreversible decision. I picked up the book I had been reading before Rick arrived home. I assume you'll want to do the same. Rick stood up slowly, his confident negotiating posture replaced by something approaching bewilderment. Maggie, I hope you're not planning to make this adversarial. We're both adults who want what's best for everyone involved. I'm planning to make informed decisions based on accurate information, I replied. I would think you'd appreciate that approach. After Rick left the room, I sat quietly in my chair, considering how dramatically the conversation dynamics had shifted in just 2 days. On Tuesday morning, Rick had announced his plans with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. By Thursday evening he was discovering that his wife had been playing an entirely different game for 30 years. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. Dad called again. He sounds stressed. Are you sure you're okay, Mom? I typed back, I'm doing very well, sweetheart. Better than I've felt in years, actually. Jennifer's response came quickly. That doesn't sound like someone whose marriage is ending. It sounds like someone whose real life is finally beginning, I replied. That weekend, Rick left early Saturday morning, claiming he needed to help Pat with apartment hunting. I used the time alone to conduct research I had been putting off for years. I drove through neighborhoods I had always found appealing but had never seriously considered. Downtown condominiums with lake views and concierge services, historic districts with restored Victorian houses and tree-lined streets, areas near the university with bookstores, cafes, and cultural events within walking distance. For the first time since we had moved to Milwaukee 40 years earlier, I was looking at housing through the lens of my own preferences, rather than practical considerations about Rick's commute or proximity to his golf course. The freedom was intoxicating. Tell me about the timeline of events that brought you here. I recounted Rick's announcement, his plans with Pat, and his assumptions about how our assets would be divided. Patricia took notes steadily, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, dollar amounts, and the source of funds I had used for investing. Your husband's discovery of your portfolio must have been quite a shock, she observed. I think he's still processing the implications. His initial assumption was that my financial independence would simply free him from supporting me while he pursued his new relationship. Patricia's pen paused over her notes. That suggests he doesn't understand how community property law works in Wisconsin. He seems to believe that marriage is a business partnership where assets can be reallocated based on current needs and desires. Unfortunately, that's a common misconception among people who haven't dealt with divorce proceedings before. Patricia consulted her notes. Let's talk about your separate property claims. You mentioned that the investment account was opened with your own earnings and maintained separately throughout the marriage. I pulled out bank statements and employment records that documented my salary deposits and investment transfers. Every contribution came from my library salary or pension. Rick never contributed funds, never made investment decisions, and was never listed on any account documentation. Patricia reviewed the papers carefully, cross-referencing dates and amounts. This is excellent documentation. Wisconsin law does recognize separate property rights for assets acquired with separate funds, even during marriage, provided they're kept separate and not commingled with marital assets. What about the house and Rick's retirement account? Those would be considered marital property subject to equitable division. The house was purchased during your marriage with marital funds, and his 401k contributions were made during the marriage with marital income. Patricia made additional note. Even if you don't need spousal support due to your financial independence, you're still entitled to an equitable share of marital assets. The math was becoming clearer. Rick's plan to support Pat financially would need to come from his share of marital assets, plus his separate retirement funds. My investment portfolio would remain intact while I also received a portion of assets we had accumulated together. There's another issue we should discuss, Patricia continued. Your husband's financial obligations to his new partner could impact his ability to meet any ongoing responsibilities from your marriage. Such if he's named as your beneficiary on any retirement accounts or insurance policies, or if there are joint debts or obligations that survive the divorce, his financial support of another person could affect his creditworthiness or ability to fulfill those commitments. I hadn't considered how Rick's generosity toward Pat might create cascading financial problems that could eventually affect me. What would you recommend? We should review all joint accounts, insurance policies, and beneficiary designations immediately. If your husband is making financial commitments that could jeopardize his solvency, we want to ensure you're protected from any fallout. That afternoon, I spent 3 hours with Patricia reviewing every financial document related to our marriage: joint bank accounts, insurance policies, credit cards, the mortgage documentation for our house, even utility bills and subscription services. The process revealed how thoroughly intertwined our financial lives had become over 60 years, and how complex the untangling would be. I'm going to recommend that we file for legal separation immediately, Patricia said as our meeting concluded. This will formalize the division process and provide legal protection for your assets while the divorce proceedings move forward. How long does that typically take? 6 months to a year, depending on how cooperative both parties are willing to be. If your husband contests the separate property claims or demands spousal support, it could take longer. And if he agrees to the asset division and doesn't claim financial hardship, we could potentially expedite the process. However, based on what you've told me about his new relationship and financial commitments, I suspect he may become less cooperative as he realizes the full implication. That evening, Rick was waiting for me when I arrived home. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and papers spread around him in a way that suggested he had been working on calculations for hours. "Maggie, we need to talk," he said without looking up from his screen. I hung up my coat and joined him at the table. "What kind of talk?" "I've been researching divorce law in Wisconsin, and I think there may be some misunderstandings about how property division works." Rick's laptop screen showed several legal websites, and I could see he had been taking notes on community property statutes. His handwriting covered several pages with calculations that appeared to involve various asset division scenarios. "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked. "Well, for example, I hadn't realized that retirement accounts earned during marriage are considered joint property regardless of whose name is on them." Rick's voice carried the strained patience of someone delivering unwelcome news. "That means my 401k and pension would be subject to division even though they're entirely from my employment. That seems fair, considering they were earned during our marriage, but it creates complications for my ability to help Pat get established financially." Rick closed his laptop and looked directly at me for the first time since I had entered the room. "I've been trying to calculate different scenarios, and the numbers don't work the way I initially thought they would." I could see the stress in Rick's expression as he began to understand that his romantic gestures toward Pat would be constrained by legal realities he hadn't anticipated. "What numbers were you hoping would work differently?" "Pat needs immediate help with her debt situation. I thought I could provide that support from my share of our assets, but if those assets are reduced by divorce settlement requirements, I won't have enough liquid funds to make a significant impact on her financial problems." Rick pulled out a handwritten sheet covered with calculations. "If we split the house proceeds and my retirement accounts 50-50, my share would be around $600,000. That sounds like a lot, but if I use $80,000 to pay off Pat's debts and another $50,000 to help her get established in a decent apartment, I'm already down to less than $500,000 for my own retirement security. and that feels insufficient. Pat wants to travel, Maggie. She's been trapped in a difficult marriage for 20 years, and she deserves to experience some of the adventures she's missed. But travel costs money, especially the kind of travel that would give her the experiences she's dreamed about. I watched Rick struggle with arithmetic that would have been obvious to anyone who had spent years managing investment portfolios. He was discovering that dramatic lifestyle changes require substantial financial resources, and his romantic impulses were colliding with practical budget constraints. Have you discussed these concerns with Pat? Rick's expression tightened. She's been very understanding about the complexity of our situation. She doesn't want to pressure me into making decisions that could hurt my long-term financial security. The carefully neutral way Rick delivered this statement suggested that Pat had, in fact, been quite vocal about her expectations for their shared future. Her understanding probably extended primarily to understanding exactly how much financial support she needed from Rick to achieve the lifestyle she desired. That's very considerate of her, I said. The problem is that my calculations assumed you would need ongoing support, which would reduce the immediate settlement but spread my obligations over time. If you're financially independent, the court might require a larger upfront settlement that would limit my flexibility to help Pat. Rick was discovering the irony of his situation. My financial independence, which he had initially viewed as liberation from spousal support obligations, actually worsened his position by increasing his share of immediate settlement costs. Have you considered suggesting that Pat address her debt situation independently before you make joint financial commitments? She's tried everything, Maggie. Debt consolidation loans, credit counseling, even bankruptcy consultation. Her ex-husband's financial abuse left her in a position where traditional solutions don't work. What about non-traditional solutions? Rick looked puzzled. Such as taking responsibility for the financial decisions that created her current situation, and developing the skills to avoid repeating those patterns. I kept my voice gentle, but the words clearly struck Rick as unsympathetic. That's a very harsh attitude towards someone who's been victimized by financial abuse. It's a realistic attitude towards someone who needs to develop financial literacy before taking on additional financial obligations. I paused, studying Rick's defensive expression. Rick, has Pat shown you documentation of this alleged financial abuse, or are you taking her word for the circumstances of her debt? Rick's face flushed with anger. I can't believe you're suggesting that Pat would lie about something that serious. I'm suggesting that $80,000 in credit card debt doesn't typically result from financial abuse. It usually results from spending choices that exceed available income. You don't know what you're talking about. Actually, I do. I've spent 30 years studying personal finance and investment strategy. High levels of credit card debt are almost always the result of systematic overspending, often combined with a failure to understand compound interest mathematics. Rick stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. This is exactly the kind of cynical attitude that's destroyed our marriage, Maggie. You can't see past spreadsheets and calculations to understand human compassion. I can see past romantic delusions to understand financial reality, I replied calmly. And the reality is that Pat is looking for someone to solve problems she created rather than someone to help her develop solutions. You're wrong about her. Then prove. Ask her to show you documentation of her ex-husband's financial abuse. Ask her to provide detailed accounting of how she accumulated $80,000 in debt. Ask her to present a realistic plan for achieving financial stability that doesn't depend entirely on your support. Rick stared at me with an expression that combined fury and something approaching panic. I don't need to interrogate someone I care about to satisfy your suspicious nature. You need to protect yourself from making financial commitments based on incomplete information. That's not suspicious, that's prudent. Rick left the kitchen without responding, but I could hear him on the phone in his study within minutes. His voice was too low for me to make out specific words, but the tone suggested he was having an intense conversation that lasted well over an hour. The next morning Rick appeared at breakfast looking like he hadn't slept well. He sat down with his coffee but didn't make eye contact, and his usual morning routine of checking email and reading news seemed abandoned. "How was your evening?" I asked pleasantly. "Difficult," Rick replied without elaborating. "Pat didn't appreciate your questions about her financial documentation." Rick's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing with anger. "Don't be smug, Maggie. It doesn't suit you." "I'm not being smug. I'm being observant. When someone becomes defensive about providing basic documentation for claims that affect your financial future, that's usually significant information." Pat explained that most of her financial records were destroyed when her ex-husband filed for divorce. He controlled all their accounts and didn't provide her with copies of statements or documentation. And her credit reports, those would show the history of debt accumulation and payment patterns. Rick was quiet for a long moment. She said her credit reports are too painful to review because they remind her of how much financial damage was done during her marriage. "Rick, do you hear yourself? You're preparing to spend your retirement savings supporting someone who won't provide basic financial documentation and claims that reviewing her own credit report is too emotionally traumatic. You wouldn't understand. You've never been in an abusive relationship where someone else controlled every aspect of your financial life." The irony of this statement was breathtaking. Rick was describing exactly the relationship he had maintained with me for 60 years, where he had controlled our financial decisions and assumed I was incapable of independent financial management. The difference was that I had developed my own financial independence quietly, rather than demanding that someone else solve my problems. "You're right," I said finally. "I've never been in that situation. I've been in a situation where someone else handled financial decisions, but I took responsibility for educating myself and building my own security rather than expecting someone else to rescue me." Rick's phone buzzed with a text message, and his expression changed as he read it. Whatever the message said, it clearly contained news he hadn't expected. "Pat needs to see me this morning," he said, standing up quickly. "There's been a development with her apartment situation." After Rick left, I called Stephen Mitchell to discuss the results of my legal consultation and the next steps for protecting my assets during divorce proceedings. Stephen listened carefully as I described Patricia Reeves' recommendations and the timeline for legal separation filing. "There's something else we should discuss," Stephen said when I finished my update. "I've arranged that introduction to the Women's Financial Literacy Organization I mentioned. Dr. Sarah Chen, the founder, would like to meet with you this week if possible. I'd be very interested in that meeting. She's particularly interested in your perspective, because you've successfully built wealth while navigating traditional gender role expectations. That's exactly the kind of knowledge that could benefit other women facing sudden financial independence." "When and where would she like to meet?" "Tomorrow afternoon at her office, if that works for your schedule. She's located in the 3rd Ward, not far from my building." After confirming the appointment, I spent the rest of the morning researching Dr. Chen's organization on. The Women's Financial Independence Project provided education, counseling, and advocacy for women experiencing economic transition due to divorce, widowhood, or other life changes. Their website featured testimonials from women who had successfully navigated financial challenges with the organization's support, and their programming included both individual counseling and group workshops on topics ranging from basic budgeting to investment strategy. The organization's mission statement resonated deeply with my emerging sense of purpose. They believed that financial literacy was a fundamental life skill that enabled independence, self-respect, and the ability to make choices based on personal values, rather than economic necessity. Their approach emphasized education over dependency, teaching women to understand and manage their own finances, rather than simply connecting them with others who would make financial decisions for them. That afternoon, Rick returned home earlier than usual, looking shaken and carrying himself with the defeated posture of someone who had received unwelcome news. He sat down heavily in his usual chair and stared out the window for several minutes without speaking. "How was your meeting with Pat?" I asked. "Her apartment application was rejected," Rick said without turning away from the window. "The landlord said her credit score was too low and her debt-to-income ratio was too high, even with a cosigner. That must have been disappointing. It was the 3rd rejection this week." Pat starting to think that she might need to consider bankruptcy after all. Rick's voice carried a note of resignation that suggested this conversation had not gone well. Bankruptcy would eliminate Pat's immediate debt obligations, but it would also eliminate Rick's opportunity to play financial hero by paying off her credit cards. That might actually be the most practical solution for her situation. It would destroy what's left of her credit for 7 years. She'd never qualify for decent housing or reasonable interest rates on anything. It would give her a fresh start without transferring her financial obligations to someone else, I pointed out. And 7 years of rebuilding credit is better than spending the next 20 years struggling with unmanageable debt. Rick finally turned to look at me, his expression a mixture of frustration and something approaching desperation. Maggie, I know you think I'm being foolish about this whole situation. I think you're letting your emotions override your financial judgment. That's not foolish, it's human, but it's also dangerous when the stakes are this high. What if I told you that Pat has agreed to sign a prenuptial agreement that would protect my assets from any future claims? I'd tell you that prenuptial agreements don't protect assets from poor financial decisions made during the marriage. If you spend your retirement savings paying her debts, no legal document can restore that money. Rick rubbed his temples, clearly grappling with realities that were more complex than his romantic fantasies had anticipated. I just want to help her build a stable life. The most helpful thing you could do is encourage her to develop the skills and knowledge she needs to build that stable life herself. Paying her bills might provide temporary relief, but it doesn't solve the underlying financial literacy problems that created her situation. And if she can't or won't do that, then you need to decide whether you're looking for a life partner or a financial dependent, because those are two very different relationships with very different cost structure. Rick sat in silence for a long time after that, staring out the window as the afternoon light faded into evening. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I thought this would be simpler. Most life changes are more complicated than we expect, I replied gently. The question is whether you're willing to make decisions based on accurate information rather than wishful thinking. That night, I lay awake thinking about the conversation with Rick and my upcoming meeting with Dr. Ch. For 60 years, I had watched women in our social circle navigate financial crises resulting from widowhood, divorce, or simple lack of financial education. Some had managed successfully, often through necessity and determination. Others had struggled with poverty, dependency, or exploitation by family members who controlled their finances. I had been fortunate to develop financial independence while still married, but that privilege came with responsibility. The knowledge and resources I had accumulated could potentially help other women avoid the pitfalls of financial dependency or recover from financial setbacks with dignity and strength. Tomorrow's meeting would be the first step in transforming my personal experience into broader social contribution. Rick's announcement that I was yesterday's news was becoming the catalyst for writing new headlines about women's financial empowerment and independence. 6 months later, I sat in my new downtown condominium watching the morning sun dance across Lake Michigan while reviewing quarterly reports from the Women's Financial Independence Project. My investment in Dr. Sarah Chen's organization had already helped 37 women transition from financial dependency to self-sufficiency, and the program was expanding faster than we had projected. The divorce proceedings had concluded more smoothly than Patricia Reeves had anticipated. Rick ultimately agreed to the asset division without contesting my separate property claims, perhaps because his own financial situation had become more precarious than he had expected. Pat's bankruptcy filing had eliminated her debt, but also eliminated Rick's opportunity to demonstrate his generosity through dramatic financial gestures. Their relationship had not survived the transition from romantic fantasy to practical reality. My new home occupied the top floor of a renovated warehouse building with floor-to-ceiling windows and enough space for a home office, where I managed both my investment portfolio and my growing philanthropic activity. The building's location put me within walking distance of theaters, museums, restaurants, and the library system where I had spent my career. For the first time in decades, my daily environment reflected my actual interests rather than someone else's preferences. Jennifer had visited the previous weekend, bringing the grandchildren to see my new space. She had wandered through the rooms with an expression of pleased surprise, commenting on the modern kitchen, the lake views, and the obvious care I had taken in selecting furniture and artwork that suited my taste. "Mom, you seem different," she had said, as we sat on my balcony watching sailboats navigate the harbor. "More confident, somehow, more like yourself. I'm discovering who I am when I'm not trying to maintain someone else's comfort," I had replied. "It's been an interesting process." The doorbell interrupted my morning review, and I opened it to find a delivery person holding an enormous bouquet of flowers. The card was signed by the latest group of women graduating from our financial literacy program, thanking me for funding their education and mentoring sessions. These women ranged in age from 35 to 78, and their stories varied widely. Some were recently divorced after decades of marriage, others were widows facing financial responsibility for the first time. A few were younger women recovering from financial abuse or poor money management decisions. What they shared was the determination to understand and control their financial futures, rather than depending on others to make crucial decisions for them. My phone rang with a call from Stephen Mitchell, who had become both my financial advisor and my partner in developing investment strategies for the foundation I had established. "Maggie, I have good news about the scholarship fund," Stephen said. "The university has agreed to our proposal for supporting women returning to school for financial planning certifications. We'll be able to fund 15 full scholarships in the first year." "That's wonderful news. When do we begin accepting applications?" "Next month. Dr. Chain will handle the screening process, and the first cohort will start classes in January." After our call ended, I returned to my balcony with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. The business section included an article about rising market volatility and recommended investment strategies for retirees concerned about portfolio stability. I smiled as I read the conventional wisdom about conservative asset allocation for older investors, advice that would have kept my portfolio at a fraction of its current value if I had followed it 30 years earlier. My investment approach had always been based on understanding businesses rather than following age-based formulas, and that strategy had served me well through multiple market cycles. Now I was using the same analytical skills to evaluate charitable organizations and social programs, looking for opportunities where financial investment could generate measurable improvements in women's economic independence. The foundation work had introduced me to policy advocates, academic researchers, and grassroots organizers who were addressing various aspects of financial inequality. I had discovered that my business background and investment experience provided valuable perspectives in discussions about program sustainability and outcome measurement. That afternoon I attended a board meeting for a regional women's shelter that was expanding their services to include financial counseling and job training programs. My contribution was funding the development of financial literacy curricula specifically designed for women recovering from economic abuse. "Margaret, your insights about long-term financial planning have been invaluable in shaping our program design," the executive director said, as our meeting concluded. "The women in our program need to understand not just budgeting basics, but how to build real economic security over time." "That's exactly right," I agreed. Emergency assistance addresses immediate needs, but education addresses systemic problems. We want to teach skills that will prevent future financial crises, not just respond to current ones. As I drove home through downtown Milwaukee, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that Tuesday morning when Rick had announced that I was yesterday's news. His attempt to diminish my relevance had actually catalyzed a period of growth, purpose, and influence that exceeded anything I had experienced during our marriage. Rick, meanwhile, had sold his share of our house and moved to a smaller apartment across town. Pat had relocated to a different state after her bankruptcy was finalized, and Rick was navigating retirement alone on a more modest budget than he had anticipated. We maintained polite but minimal contact, usually limited to coordination around family events involving the grandchildren. My evenings were filled with activities I had always wanted to pursue but had never prioritized during my married years. I had joined an investment club, composed of retired women who managed substantial portfolios. I was taking Italian language classes in preparation for a trip to Tuscany that I was planning for the spring. I had season tickets to the symphony and had developed friendships with other regular attendees who shared my appreciation for classical music. The social isolation that Rick had predicted for a woman my age living alone had not materialized. Instead, I had discovered communities of intelligent, engaged women who were creating fulfilling lives based on their own interests and values, rather than traditional expectations about appropriate behavior for older women. That evening, I prepared dinner for myself in my new kitchen, something I had come to enjoy after decades of cooking primarily for others. I set my table with the good china I had rarely used during my marriage, poured a glass of wine, and sat down to eat, while watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. My phone buzzed with a text message from one of the women in our current financial literacy cohort. She had just opened her first investment account and wanted to share her excitement about purchasing her first. Her message reminded me of the enthusiasm I had felt 30 years earlier when I made my first investment in Johnson, not knowing that modest beginning would eventually grow into financial independence and the ability to support causes I cared about. After dinner, I opened my laptop to review the day's market activity and check on my portfolio performance. The numbers continued to reflect steady growth, and the dividend income provided reliable funding for both my living expenses and my charitable activity. I was no longer accumulating wealth for some undefined future purpose. I was using it strategically to create positive change while maintaining the security I had worked decades to achieve. As I prepared for bed, I walked past the framed photograph on my nightstand, a picture of myself taken at the Women's Financial Independence Project's recent fundraising gala. I was standing with Doc Chen and several program graduates, all of us smiling with the confidence of women who understood their own worth and capabilities. Rick had been wrong about many things, but his assessment that I was yesterday's news had been his most significant miscalculation. I wasn't yesterday's news, I was today's headlines and tomorrow's breaking stories, and the best part was that I was finally the author of my own narrative. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.